All right, we'll officially get started. Hello and welcome to Welty at Home. We are the virtual slow reading book club that alternates works by Eudora Welty with authors connected to Eudora Welty in some way. We are reading and discussing The Optimist's Daughter, and we are doing that because this is the 50th anniversary of Welty receiving the Pulitzer Prize for this novel. My name is Jessica Russell. I'm with the Eudora Welty House and Garden, and I'm so happy to say that our discussions will be moderated by Dr. Suzanne Mars, Professor Emerita of Millsaps College, a friend of mine and a friend of Eudora Welty. I'm going to keep letting more people in, Okay, and I've got some things to tell you. If you want to comment or ask a question, be sure to use the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, and you can click that raise hand function. I'll be trying to help Dr. Mars look for your raised hand so you can participate, and be sure to keep an eye on the chat. There's always a great conversation going on in the chat. Speaking of the chat, I'm going to share a link with you right now. I don't know if you have heard, but the Eudora Welty digital archives are now available to the public. This is a big deal. Samples of Eudora Welty's correspondence, manuscripts, photos, and other media housed at Mississippi Department of Archives and History are now available online. So I'm going to give this little link to you guys, and then we'll proceed. All right, Dr. Mars, where would you like to start?
Well, first, I'm going to start by saying I am thrilled to see a real expert on The Optimist's Daughter. Lynn Evans is with us today. So, Lynn, it's so great to see you. Oh, there you are. Thank you. Thanks for that wave. Let me begin with some backgrounds, and then we'll talk about part 3 of the novel. One important source of background information for part 3 comes in One Writer's Beginnings, the second section called Learning to See. And in this section of One Writer's Beginnings, Eudora Welty discusses Chestina Welty, her mother's life in West Virginia, her mother's time as a teacher, her mother's relationship with her own mother, Eudora Carden Andrews, and the accounts, and she talks about her father, Edward Raboteau Ned Andrews. She talks about her father's gift to her of a set of Dickens, and about the way she rescued that set at age 15, a different sort of rescue than we see in the novel, but a rescued set of Dickens. Any case, she talks about taking her mother, Chestina, taking her desperately ill father to a hospital in Baltimore where he died. Talks about her mother's time as a school teacher in West Virginia, about the meeting of Chestina and Christian Webb Welty when he worked at a logging camp in West Virginia, about her mother's brothers, about the letters from Eudora Carden Andrews to Chessie and Eudora, and about the letters from Chris and Chestina to each other. So all of that background information shows you how closely Welty was drawing on an actual experience and transforming it. And the transformation, I think, is something that would be really interesting for us to discuss sometime in the future. Let me just tell you that Eudora Carden Andrews, Eudora Welty's grandmother, was born in 1858, died in 1914. Her grandfather, Edward Raboteau Andrews, Ned, born in 1862, died in 1899. Her father, Christian Webb Welty, born in 1879, died 1931. And her mother, Mary Chestine Andrews Welty, born in 1883, died in 1966. So there's an important set of biographical important description of her mother's life and the West Virginia backgrounds of this novel. Let me say that there's also an important source of background information newly opened, this year opened, at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, and that is the Welty family papers are now open. There are letters from Chestina to her husband or her fiance, her beloved, from him to Chestina, from Chestina to her mother, from her mother to Chestina. There are letters from Eudora to her parents and other relatives, and from them to her. So all of this is now open. It's fascinating. It's wonderful to meet her parents as young people in their letters, the letters which were saved on both sides. All right. Now, a third set of background details that turn up in the novel are found at the Welty house. And there is the stone boat given by Christian Webb Welty to his wife, carved by hand from a river rock with his initials on it. And we're going to be able to see that, which is on display at the visitor center. There is a photo album.
Suzanne, can you see the rock?
Yes, I see it now.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
good. Thank you. There is a photo album that was put together by Chestina, of photographs that she and her husband, Chris, took of each other when they were courting. One of the great pleasures I had was sitting with Eudora and Mary Alice, her niece, and going through that album one afternoon. And that album is mentioned here. There is also, most importantly, I think for our purposes, the writing desk found in Eudora's bedroom. And let me tell you a little bit about that. I've just been writing myself about it, so I'll read what I've written about it. Can we get that big view of that, Jessica?
Can you see it now?
Yeah, could we put it just solely up by itself? No?
Oh, is that not what you have? Hang on.
No, I've got to.
How is that?
There we go. On May 15th, 1946, in the aftermath of World War II and the publication of Delta Wedding, Welty wrote to her agent in high spirits about her purchase of a new piece of furniture for her bedroom at 1119 Pinehurst Street. This plantation desk, she told Dermot Russell, was an old Natchez piece made for some occasion, no doubt, because the date 1804 is set very prominently into the table part. It's a little cherry one full of pigeonholes. It has an eagle on top, pewter, due to the Louisiana purchase. I wonder, maybe it was the custom. And I'm wondering if I'll be conscious of an eagle in the room with me all the time. Whether she was conscious of the eagle or not, this desk remained always in her room for her sole use as something of a personal post office. Historically, the public function of such desk. It is a simple yet beautiful handmade piece with two small drawers beneath a fold-out, felt-covered writing surface, pigeonholes of unfinished wood inside the finished cabinet, and tapered, uncarved legs. Welty's 1946 description of the desk essentially reappears in The Optimist's Daughter, but with a few telling changes. When late at night Laurel ventures into the sewing room, she saw that here was where her mother's secretary had been exiled. The gooseneck lamp threw its dimmed beam on the secretary's warm brown doors. It had been made of the cherry trees on the McKelvey place a long time ago. On the lid, the numerals 1817 had been set into a not quite perfect oval of different wood, something smooth and yellow as a scrap of satin. It had been built as a plantation desk, but was graceful and small enough for a lady's use. Laurel's mother had entire claim on it. On its pediment stood a lead mold eagle, spreading its wings and clasping the globe. It was about the same breadth as her mother's spread out hand. Within, the cabinet looked like a little wall out of a country post office, which nobody had in years disturbed by calling for their mail. This is the desk, save for the changed date, that Eudora purchased. But here the desk belongs to a character very clearly based on Chestina Welty, not on Eudora. Like Chestina Welty, Becky McKelvey is a daughter of West Virginia, the only daughter in a family with 6 brothers. Chessie had 5 brothers, who has settled in Mississippi with her husband. But Becky's secretary is not the larger, more elaborate one Christian Webb Welty gave his wife. It is the one his daughter bought for herself 15 years after his death. Moreover, the fictional husband, Clinton McKelvey, is unlike Christian Webb Welty in many ways, in being a native of Mississippi, not Ohio. The 1817 date inlaid on the desk marks Clinton McKelvey's family history in Mississippi from statehood onward. In having survived his wife, he is different from Mr. Welty, and in having married again. Still, the plantation desk, made of trees on the McKelvey place, evokes the dresser made from trees on Chris's childhood home and located in the house's dining room. The desk thus marks the confluence of the lives of three Weltys, Eudora, Chestina, and Chris. All right, let me just mention a couple of other sources. One is a favorite of mine because it was told to me by my friend Ann Morrison, who was also a great friend of Eudora's and of Charlotte Capers. And Eudora called up Ann Morrison one evening and asked her if she could use a story about her son, Barry, because Barry Ann had told them, had been having his girlfriend at age 15 arrive, climb in through his window, and the story was they were playing chess and listening to Duke Ellington. So Anne said, well, let me ask Barry if it's okay. And Barry said it would be fine. So that's how that story got into the novel. The name McKelvey comes from Hunter McKelvey Mac Cole, who works at the University Press and who Eudora had known from his days as a student at Millsaps College. And the line from Judge McKelvey about Laurel's wedding, when Miss Tennyson says, isn't it the saddest thing? And Judge McKelvey replies, if I had thought there was anything sad to be said for it, I should have prevented it, is a line that Judge Creekmore said when his daughter Mitty married Walter Welty. So there's a kind of kaleidoscope of sources here as well. Let me say one last thing, and that is, I think Phil's craving for his unlived life, I wanted it, could be based on any of three men in Eudora Welty's life. Her brother, her father, who died in 1931 at a young age, her brother Walter at a younger age in 1959, and her brother Edward in 1966. All their unlived lives, all they might be calling out for it. So those are some backgrounds of sources to the novel. Now let me shut up and let's talk about part three. I think in this part of the novel, the McKelvey home plays a really crucial role, becomes almost a character, and we see it first in Becky's domain, the garden, and then in the judge's study. We find out more about both. We find out about both her parents in the garden and in the study, but more about the judge in the study. And then in Becky's sewing room, which had been so important to young Laurel. Through these moves in the house upstairs, the house is a kind of emblem of the mind. We see Laurel's repression ebbing and her insight into herself growing. And we as readers find ourselves coming to know all three McKelveys and their community more completely. And we learn to know these people and this place in the way that we learn to know people and places in our everyday lives, incrementally, slowly, and in fits and starts. So let's take these three settings and focus our discussion on the sections that take place in the three settings and go wherever you would like to go. So let's start in the garden with the four Mount Salus ladies, Tish, Adele, Mrs. Bolt, the minister's wife, and Mrs. Pease, the next door neighbor, and Laurel. What about this? And don't let me, Jessica, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to make sure we have plenty of time for the third, for the final section of the chapter, the fourth.
Okay.
Yeah, the fourth section. Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
also going to show pictures of the deck chairs and the garden rose area while y'all talk about the garden. So just don't mind me.
Okay, so what about the garden? Where shall we start here? Anyone? Anyone interested in the garden? What about, I'll tell you, one of my favorite lines, two of my favorite lines in the novel come from this section. And one is when one of the ladies says, you know, what Faye didn't know, she didn't know how to separate an egg. Things like that get around. Or frying pan was the one thing that in the kitchen she knew the name of. What about those ladies? And why is that important, do you think? Nobody likes this question. Beverly, you're going to help me out? Good.
I really liked this section because I think that the ladies were people that I know. I mean,
Okay.
they were such, you know, that everything's over, everybody's sitting around chatting, and they're not only letting their hair down, but they're letting their claws out as well. And kind of dragging Faye over the flames, except, you know, Miss Adele, I believe it's Miss Adele, who at one point expresses some sympathy for her, about some sympathy for Faye. And sort of being out of her element, but I found it very amusing, you know, to sit there and listen to them and their discussion, while Laurel is really just going about her business. I mean, you know, she's taking it all in, but she's not participating. She's just letting them lead the conversation.
Yeah, she's silent. We're going to get her to say one thing, and finally she's going to speak, and finally she's going to laugh, but she's pretty silent here. Teresa, what do you think about it?
I liked it because it really resembles people. An event happened. There were, you know, nobody likes Faye. We discussed that the entire time last time. And the ladies spent their entire time analyzing and criticizing. And it's so true to life. It's just, it's precious. And I think Welty really captured it. And the other thing is that the ladies really loved Becky, and it shows. And again, it's like people, when you love someone and there's a replacement, you really want to criticize the replacement.
All right, yeah. The ladies are pretty, as Beverly said, and as you're pointing out, they've got their claws out. And I'm not sure that they're describing an atmosphere in which I would want to live, where you've got to prove your housekeeping. You got to get that bed made on time. You got to have your kitchen skills. You got to cook your Sunday lunch. You better be married or you're not going to fit in. On the other hand, I love what you're saying too, that they love Becky, and that comes through, and the power of that connection. Cheryl, I missed you last time, Cheryl.
I know, sorry guys. I actually like that they're talking about Faye's lack of feminine wifely skills, because it puts us into that specific time period and into that small community of what was expected of a woman. Also, if we could look at Marcia Huff's question about the sienna colored leaves, I'd like an answer to that. But here's what really gets me is Eudora Welty and her use of birds. At the beginning of this, the four ladies plus Laurel, on top of the tree, the mockingbird threw out his chest and let fall a cascade of song. And the mockingbird, of course, mimics dozens of birds, and it's the Mississippi state bird. And at 2 or 3 different points during this particular conversation, Welty inserts something about the mockingbird. Singing over her words when Miss Adele was speaking, the mockingbird poured out his voice without stopping. And Miss Adele was speaking again while the mockingbird sang. So I just really want to know what Miss Welty's fascination was with birds.
All right, and we've also got the cardinals at the end of the chapter, and we have a lot of associations of Faye with birds. So we'll come back to that. But first, I think Susan is going to, Susan Haltom, who knows more than anybody else about the Welty Garden, is going to tell us, I bet she'll tell us about those sienna bright leaves as well as.
I certainly will. And
Good,
I
thank you.
feel a kinship with Becky because I like to sew. I love to garden. I love to cook, and they're all self-taught. And it comes to my mind that while Becky had a child. Faye didn't have any children. And so Becky had to keep house. She had to do these things. And Faye was, I don't know what she was doing, looking at herself in the mirror. But anyway, because somebody asked about sienna, yes, it is an artist pigment, but tea roses have new growth that is red. So if you have a hybrid tea rose, which many people grow, but Eudora liked to grow, yeah, there it is. That's the red new growth on a tea rose. And so my favorite quote is about memory returning like spring. Memory had the character of spring. In some cases, it was the old wood that did the blooming. Y'all may know when you prune things, you have to know whether growth starts on new wood, like you cut it back in February, like the tea rose, and then they bloom and carry on from there, or you should cut from old wood, last year's wood. So in some cases, the old wood does the blooming. And that to me just shows the character of appreciating memory, appreciating older things, and not just coming in and recklessly out with the old and in with the new, like Faye.
I'm glad you brought that up, Susan. Here is Becky, who is a creative person, and she's creative in her garden and in her house and her household management, but the garden especially. And she's a person who is in tune with the natural world, who is not and battle with it, but is living in harmony with it. And I think Laurel's bringing that out. And then the use of Becky's climber as an emblem of memory and the importance of memory, and that importance as it's going to play out in the course of the novel. Yeah, Alec. Oh, we can't hear you, Alec.
Sorry, going to say a thing or two about words. Welty always seems to place words that are function as kind of images around in names and in other places. For instance, Becky's climber. Well, it's really not Becky who's the climber, it's Faye who's the climber in this story. But also the words court and judge turn up over and over. Judge McKelva, the courthouse is mentioned numerous times. They go past it getting from the funeral to the house. And when Judge first noticed a flash in his eyes, it was when he was looking at the courthouse. And you have Dr. Cortland and Miss Adele Cortland. Well, what's all that court and judging about? Well, among other things, these women sitting around in the garden are judging. The clause or the judgments come out. And Faye didn't, Laurel didn't want the casket to be open because she didn't want all those people seeing her dad, which would be like a judging. So anyway, just a thing about words.
Yeah, I think it's important that Adele points out that the ladies are pretty hard on Faye when their behavior at the funeral has itself not been ideal, and there's a kind of balance here, and I think we see that, and we see them as rivals. There may be rival cocks, the birds may be rival cocks, but the ladies are also rivals. Yeah. One other thing I wanted to mention here, I think that's it. Anything else about the first section? Yeah, Pearl and Harriet.
Rivals to whom? One another for the judge. I mean, Adele, I think, is pretty, disappointed in her relationship now with the judge, with Faye there. And they're sort of threatening Laurel, like, well, if you go, that's going to be it. That's going to be it.
Yeah.
It says, of course she can give up Mount Solace and say goodbye to this house and to us in the past and go to Chicago day after tomorrow, leave flying a jet and take up one more time where she left off. I mean, they're really taunting her, but who do you suggest?
Well, I was thinking of the two communities as rivals, the Chisholms and the Mount Silas community, but I think you're right too. I mean, there are all kinds of rivalries going on, and there's the rivalry between the first wife and the second wife, at least certainly felt by Faye,
Mhm.
and felt by Laurel.
And do you think that Adele had hopes for a
I've
relationship?
always thought so. Yeah, yeah. But that he couldn't see her. Yeah. Harriet.
Yeah, Laurel is in this section goes to say that the rivalry is ultimately not between the dead and the living wives, but between too much love and not enough.
Yeah.
And
I was saving that for later, but go ahead.
you got to rivalries, I couldn't resist.
No, no.
But I'm thinking too that the voices are, after all, simultaneously judging Laurel's own self-failures of self-sacrificing womanly, as they are critical of her having chosen an artist life, a selfish life that has kept her from being at home for her father. It's the same kind of accusation that Faye is going to make, has made about Laurel, saying that she wouldn't have gone off and left anyone behind who needed her just to be an artist and make money. And so I think I'm back to my sense of Faye as a kind of grotesque double for Laurel as she thinks about reconciling her daughter self with her artist self, and the community's role in pushing that dilemma into her vision in the garden.
Yeah, I think this first section also suggests that Laurel is a creative person, but Becky is a creative person as well. And the ways to be creative are multiple. But the ladies of the town don't see that very clearly, I think. Shall we go on to section 2? And Laurel goes into the house, into her father's study, and there are lots of books in there, lots of books. There is Sherlock Holmes, there is Jeeves, there is Dickens, there is Gibbon. What about this focus upon books? Why the library and itemizing the books in the library, do you think? And there are 5,000 books in the Eudora Welty house too, so a sizable personal library. Anything? Yeah, Teresa.
I think it goes back to that quote, which we all know that I can't paraphrase, is that books are your friends. Again, it's a little bit more than that. And it's going down memory lane, reliving each reading of that book. Her parents read to each other. So it's going back to the relationship between her parents, as well as her memories of those books themselves.
Yeah, let me let Marcia.
Well, if you want to know someone, one way to know them is to know what they've read, what they value in their reading. Mm-hmm. And a collection of books is an entree to a person's intellects, feelings, their soul. So it's a way of characterizing her father and mother. Yeah, they do love books. And the books, it's an eclectic collection. Right. There's humor, there's history, there's serious work. Yeah. There's serious work, there's humor. And I think, for Eudora Welty, the book was central to her life, obviously. And not just as a writer, but as a reader. She loved reading. And she said, novels are made by the imagination, for the imagination. It's a work of imagination that sparks the imagination. And she also said that she never doubted that writing was a way of imagining yourself into lives not your own. It's a way of connecting. And then her parents read together, so they are reading aloud to each other as
also Eudora's friends, Bill and Emmy Maxwell, read aloud to each other, just as her parents had. And it's a way of communicating and of recognizing yourself in other people, other places, of transcending the self and connecting with others that, for instance, Faye, who doesn't read, doesn't do. So here is, I think that's the value here in part. Yeah, Cheryl.
So listen, y'all, don't share this outside of the book club, but I'm 41 and single. So I have looked at dating apps, and there is one for book lovers, but apparently that's not very successful. Even if you read the same things, it's not necessarily a successful, you don't have as much in common as you might think. And there's the quote, I just lost it. Dang it, because I was getting ready to put something else in the chat. Can I, Suzanne, can I like come back on in a moment? Okay.
Yeah. I wanted to mention also that Laurel says about her parents reading to each other, sometimes between two people, every word is beautiful. And here again, we have her kind of repressing the struggles that her parents were going to go through. So romanticizing the past. She's remembering the past. She's remembering them reading together. She's confronting the books that looking at the books that they had in their house, but she's not looking as clearly at it as she's going to, I think.
I found it. It's the quote is, for every book here, she had heard their voices, fathers and mothers, and perhaps it didn't matter to them, not always, what they read aloud. It was the breath of life flowing between them and the words of the moment writing on it that held them in delight. That's beautiful.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. Joe Ellen. We can't hear you yet.
Sorry, I was just commenting that this section really falls into a few sections. On the first page, we're tempted to think about the role of objects. She mentions the bookcase, the portraits, the books themselves, things in her father's study. And she does the books then, and she works her way into her father's papers. And when she's talking about his documents, that she talks about his public life, which balances the sense of his public life that we got from all of the cronies before the funeral, when he was the mayor of Mount Salus, papers having to do with the big flood, that kind of thing. So we really get some balance there. And then we see what he sees out the window, Adele waving and him not seeing her. And it's interesting, the short rehearsal of the Cortlands who moved in from the country and plowed the field behind their house. And that made me realize why she talked about Nate Cortland's country in his gaze. He's a New Orleans doctor, et cetera, et cetera. And then we go on to his desk. But I really find those movements interesting and revealing.
I think if Becky is a creative person, the judge is too. He's a creative thinker for his community. Flood control, building new schools, serving the public, helping young people like Nate, and reaching beyond himself in a kind of creative way. And here have been his papers. You know? So again, that whole idea of communication, connection. Anything else here? Jessica.
I think we're starting to see this interesting thing where Eudora Welty is using external setting to indicate in Laurel's internal state. And in this part of the book, we've started in the garden and people are having a conversation about her and she's still very internal. And now we've gone into the house and we're at her father's papers. We're seeing a little bit more of her, and we're going to see more and more of her as this chapter progresses. And as we get more and more interior into the home.
Yes. So this is much more interior than the first section. And we find her seeing a picture of herself on her father's desk with her husband, their wedding picture. her father had put it in a silver frame. She says her marriage had been of magical ease, brevity, and conclusion, and all belonging to Chicago and not here. So here Phil is coming in again, briefly. Yeah, Harriet?
I was just going to plug Sarah Ford because Sarah's having technical difficulties today, can't speak. And I wanted to say that she has this great article in Welty and Mystery on the body in the library, thinking about Agatha Christie's use of that title, and then looking at the books in the library, as well as the idea of detective. So,
yeah. Oh, yeah. So those read Sarah Ford. Yeah. And I'm sorry Sarah can't get on. Maybe she'll still be able to do it. I wanted to say one more thing about the photo, though. Again, here we have Laurel progressing a ways. We're getting more internal view, but her husband's life had been of magical ease and brevity, but that's not the whole story. And she's not confronting her own sense of loss here. So as she backs off from here at this point, from thinking about what had become of her parents' marriage, as Becky falls ill, she's backing away from thinking about Philip too, and of keeping him framed in the silver frame. So, and one other thing, what's missing here in the judge's desk? All the letters from Becky. He has destroyed them as he's answered them, as he's read them. When she's been away, he has destroyed them. And if she wanted him, he went. And so here are these, the letters missing. It's interesting that Eudora Welty's father kept his wife's letters. We have all of those letters. They're wonderful letters. And she kept his to her. And Eudora kept them. So they're now part of the family papers at the Department of Archives. Anything else here? Anything else? Beverly?
I think it's interesting too that the statement is made when we find out that Judge McKelvey has destroyed the letters and any of the papers, you know, as he read them, they went straight in the garbage. She says there was nothing for Faye to find, as if Faye would have looked through the house for love letters or whatever to, I would think, punish Judge McKelvey for keeping that much of Becky around.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't destroy him when he married Faye. I mean, apparently, according to what we see with Laurel, he did it. But her thinking is that Faye would have looked for them, but there was nothing for her to find.
But when she does go in to find her Becky's letters, then she hasn't looked at them at all. So, you know, and those might be the ones that you would think she wanted to know what he had said about that, but she hasn't bothered to look at that. What the written word is unimportant to her, and I think that's another mark of her solipsism, you know, that she can't get outside herself. If you're writing letters, you're trying to communicate, you're co-responding, you're doing something that is a joint activity here, back and forth. But yeah, Harriet?
I was just going to say that having gotten into the family letters last April, I am so struck with the reality of these letters. The fact that the family letters carry the courtship letters between Chris and Chessie, and they're gorgeous. And I fell in love with Chessie as Chris must have over those letters. But the idea that I find myself thinking of Eudora finding the letters herself and wondering, you know, when it was that she first discovered that trove, and how amazing it is to have that kind of access to your parents' lives, to your mother's thoughts. Yeah.
And I think she must have read them before writing The Optimist's Daughter, because so much of that is in here, though Laurel does not read them. I wanted to say one last thing about this section, and then let's move to Laurel's coming into the stormy house with a bird flying through the house and going back into the sewing room. Notice that there are little tracks on the desk, little fingerprints of little tracks of nail polish going across the desk, and Laurel scrupulously removes those. They're phase tracks, she thinks, and they sound like bird tracks. And Faye is associated with the bird, been associated with the bird before, and then that bird gets in the house. Bad luck, bird in the house. And for Laurel, I think it's almost as if Faye is defiling the house as that bird flies through the house, and drives her deeper and deeper into the upstairs, closing her door, going into her parents' room, stopping the bird from there, and then retreating from the pink satin-filled room into the sewing room. So let's talk about that, since it's really so powerful. We come to here at the end of this section, the end of part 3. What about this section? What stands out to you? Marcia, I think I see a comment on your face.
I have been thinking about this, but it's not about the same things people have been talking about, the physical aspect of it, although you do find out where you see Laurel's early interest in art, in fabric and designing through her playing with the scraps that her mother left as she sewed. But I was really struck by Becky's story, which going back, including the story of her taking her father to Baltimore all by herself, not knowing Baltimore, not knowing anything, not knowing how to do anything, and yet doing the whole thing on her own. And when at the end of, it's in this book, you don't know anybody in Baltimore, they asked Becky after her father died, but Becky had known herself. And that is a very important theme. It harkens back to what Eudora wrote in the funeral section, where she's talking about looking around at the people. Laura's looking around at the people in the room. They might have come out of that night in the hospital waiting room, all out of all times of trouble, past or future, the great interrelated family of those who never know the meaning of what has happened to them. And that she definitely, it's that self-knowledge, that understanding of one's life, the unexamined life. This is the examined life. And Becky clearly knows herself. These people, the Chisholms and the crazy people in the hospital, they are people who don't know what's happening to them. They don't know themselves. They don't know their place, meaning their situation in the world, in time. So I think that theme, Becky illustrates the opposite of the people who don't know what's happening to them.
All right, yeah, Becky's courage and her self-knowledge.
Self-knowledge, yes.
Yeah. Baltimore was as far a place as you could go with someone, and there they left you. And so Becky has gone as far as a person can go with her father. She's at age 16 been able to do this independently. Such an independent person. Yeah. What else? Self-knowledge, independence of Becky. Yeah, Cheryl.
I just feel like there's Welty is talking also about society in transition and honoring cultural traditions, but do all of them need to be honored? Because Faye refuses to have the judge buried next to Becky. But my question is Faye going to, at the end of her life, want to be buried next to the judge? So it's a very selfish thing. And also the judge's plot is right next to the highway. So they could barely get through the ceremony without hearing. And so Laurel going through this house by herself with that bird, it's like the transition. It's like a moment or symbolic of that transition. She's in the old house that's been changed due to the outside presence of Faye.
All right, thank you. Beverly.
I think this section about Becky also shows how very different she is from Judge McKelva. You know, when we see her as her health is failing and she's lost her eyesight, and she is raging against the, you know, the dying light. You know, she is not going gentle into that good night. And when we see Judge McKelva, he just is on the bed impassive the whole time. Even as his life is ebbing away, he's accepting of it. You know, we've seen in several places where the word optimist comes up, but he's very accepting of what's happened to him, whereas Becky is not. Becky's lashing out. She's not going gently or peacefully.
I love the Dylan Thomas allusion. Do not go gently into that good night.
Right.
Rage against the dying of the light. Becky is raging, and part of the reason she's raging is that she's in despair. She's blind. She's bedridden. She can't engage in the kind of creative endeavors that have made her life meaningful, like her father before her, who don't let them tie me down or I'll die. That's the way she feels, tied down, she'll die. The judge seems to have accepted being tied down. I think it kills him too, because he's led a very active public life. He's done a lot, but when he can't move, forward, he is in despair. The very despair that Becky had that he couldn't recognize. And I have to say, I kind of, in a way, sympathize with him and his, because whenever I've had someone in desperate condition, I always think, I will fix it. I'm going to find some way to fix it. And ultimately, there are things you can't fix. And that is hard to bear. It is hard to bear for somebody you love and you can't do it. And I think that's what he's having to face now, and it's what he had to face. It's what he had to face in New Orleans. It's what he had to face years earlier with Becky. Marcia.
Well, actually, I don't understand this part about Becky's dying. First of all, I don't know what did she die of? It's so mysterious to me. I'm assuming maybe what they thought was a cataract turned out to be a brain tumor or something that encroached upon her entire vision. And then she died maybe of cancer, but I didn't understand the pure facts of it. But also, I don't understand her taking her anger out on other people. Why did she say to Laura, you could have saved your mother's life, but you stood by and wouldn't intervene. I despair for you. Why does she say that?
Harriet. I'm gonna come back to the cause of the death.
That's what I want to talk about, because, you know, I want to say that I just find this section so moving about what happens to love in a final illness, the way in which it's the dilemma and the strain on love. You know, I guess I want to talk about the judge as optimist. I'm thinking of the line, he was not passionately enough grieved at the changes in her. He seemed to accept them, even to love them. He needed guidance to see the tragic. He believed his wife's troubles would turn out all right if, because there was nothing he would not give her, he starts being what he scallingly called the optimist. Whatever she did, he was, whatever she was driven to say was all right. It was not all right. Her trouble was that very desperation the one she desperately loved, who refused to consider that she was desperate. It was betrayal upon betrayal. She needs, what she needs is for him to register the tragedy of it and to rail against the dying of the light as she is. And then when she says that to Laurel, you know, I'm thinking of how of that sense that you know, if there's a moment when she says to Clint that I married a coward, and she holds his hand so that he can bear it. I feel that same interaction with her daughter, as her daughter can't save her. She wants to hold her hand as she tells her that she needed to try. She needed to do something. She could have saved her. The desperation, the darkness, the storm, all the things that are suggested in the next section as the storm comes in and the bird thrashes, that sense of being caught in a dilemma that is all going to end in death.
Yeah, I think I agree. Does that help, Marcia? Is that not quite, doesn't quite answer?
Marcia, I accidentally muted you trying to help. Can you repeat? I'm sorry.
No, it doesn't. Why would she have said you could have saved your mother's life? Laura couldn't have done anything. It's almost like being cruel, just being nasty to Laurel.
But
And
I think
so what we get is anger. She says something nasty to her husband. She calls him a coward. She says something nasty to her daughter that her daughter has to live with then for the rest of her life. I really lost respect for Chessie. For Becky.
I would say it's time. I don't lose respect for Chessie, but I do think that she is not herself. She is desperately ill. She cannot see. She cannot go about her daily life, and it's destroying her, and she doesn't feel the kind of connection that she wants, and she's not herself, and she lashes out. And I think it's not, and I think Laurel realizes that too. And I think this is the thing that we have to forgive at times as they happen, because people are not themselves always. Yeah. Let me let Laura and then Harriet.
I really struggled with this too, and the anger, but then, yeah, I see Becky's anger. That makes sense to me. Just that the raging at that, you know, why that anyone would have. Why is this happening to me? Why isn't anybody able to do anything? And that sort of loneliness of not having somebody to share that anger and those, because, and I guess that to me is, I think, what is so interesting about this section is that we get that insight into why the judge, how he handled his pain through turning to optimism. And that's why some people do that. And it really helped me understand, look back to the opening when we get that word for the first time, that he went into that doctor's appointment as a very different person I see now than as I saw him when I first saw him at the beginning of the book, that he carried that in a very different way than I certainly read it. But I think what I was really trying to understand is how Laurel was going to handle her grief and how she had handled it, and that sort of echo between when Becky says, you know, but you could have saved your mother's life, like, but you stood by and you wouldn't intervene. I despair for you. And that echoed back to the hospital scene and how she did just, in a sense, stand there and couldn't intervene, where Faye was the one who was raging. Faye was raging.
Yeah, and part of the tragedy is that there is no way to save her life. She can't save it, as Marcia says. She's helpless to do it. But still, there is the horror of not being able to, of wanting to. And
Yeah.
and Becky is wanting to be saved. Yeah, Harriet.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Becky and what's happening to her, and just feeling as if we have to acknowledge that there's a change that's happening to her as she's dying. And I'm thinking about after the stroke, as she moves further into darkness, not just not able to see because of the eye, but because of the stroke, that she believes she was being taken somewhere neither home nor up home. And then she seems to retreat into darkness, dying without speaking a word, in exile and humiliation. That I think one of the things that moves me about this section is Welty's capturing what happens to people in those in that final descent of a long illness, not a sudden death, but an illness that isolates, and Becky in the final scene is unable to speak or to recognize that anyone is there with her, and that's what's been going on in these insults.
Yeah, it's the loss, the dementia that comes, and the tragedy of it for her and for those who love her, for all of them. What about the final section here about Phil? And then we'll come at the end of part 3. Laurel has recalled all of this, which she's been repressing before, and just allowing happy memories to arise. A flood of feeling descended on Laurel. She let the papers slide from her hand and the books from her knees, and put her head down on the open lid of the desk and wept in grief for love and for the dead. She lay there with all that was adamant in her yielding to this night, yielding at last. Now all she had found her. The deepest spring in her heart had uncovered itself, and it began to flow again. If Phil could have lived, but Phil was lost. Nothing of their life together remained except in her own memory. Love was sealed away into its perfection and had remained there. If Phil had lived, she had gone on living with the old perfection, undisturbed and undisturbing. Now by her own hands, the past had been raised up, and he looked at her, Phil himself, here waiting all the time, Lazarus. He looked at her out of eyes wild with the craving for his unlived life, with mouth open like a funnel's. What would have been their end then? Suppose their marriage had ended like her father and mother's, or like her mother's father and mother's, like Laurel, 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 Phil's voice cried. She wept for what happened to life. I wanted it, Phil cried. His voice rose with the wind in the night and went around the house and around the house. It became a roar. I wanted it. So here we close with this, which, very little mention of Phil till now. We know that at the funeral, someone says, well, she lost her husband in the war, her body never recovered. We know that there's that photograph on the desk, and her marriage had been of magical ease, she says, and now this in the wake of what's going on. Yeah, Pearl. We can't hear you, Pearl.
Whole beautiful section that you just read to us. So
I know
lovely
I can hardly read it without crying, I have to say.
hear that. But it reminds me of something that Pamela Travers wrote that says, that which is lost is waiting to be found. And that kind of puts a positive spin on this last scene that you read, that she does find Phil again. And that helps me to read that the last paragraph where Phil is shouting, roaring, I want, to be very affirmative, that
Right.
she finds that memory and she has that memory. And that's more than nothing. That's more than zero. She has it still.
Yes. Yeah, and she's willing to say he wanted it no matter what life held.
Exactly.
Life is unpredictable. Life holds tragedies, but I wanted it. Yeah, I wanted that
something.
one.
It's
Yeah.
something way more than nothing.
The losing battle.
Yeah. The losing battles, despite those losing battles, I wanted it. Yeah. Anything else here at the end? So that she has found the past, and in the, well, we'll see next time what happens the next morning after this dark night of the soul. Yeah. Harriet.
I just end on the note of of bringing up the idea of protection in this book, when so much of it is about, first female protection and the major, wanting to protect Faye, and the way in which the Optimist is about a kind of protection, and in these last sentences, Laurel's thinking about the way in which she's been living with the old perfection, undisturbed and undisturbing. The idea of losing someone and not having that relationship gotten into the place where Becky and Clint's did, which is incredibly messy, because it's frozen, because it doesn't happen, because it doesn't evolve. So just the idea of, that makes me think about losing a parent early in your life, and that sense of having guarded the memory. When I was thinking back to your talking about Eudora's father, being there in the character Phil, but something to take forward as we read the next section.
I think in some sense that Eudora probably had romanticized the life of her own father, and now is thinking here, his life was cut short. Yeah.
Mhm.
Pearl?
Yes, we weren't able to join last week because we were taking care of our great grandson. And so you probably already read this line, but I think it works for the whole novel, and especially what we're trying to understand about these characters, as well as about the living people, or the people that lived. And that's in part 2, on page 931, where Laurel thinks the mystery of how little we know of people is no greater than the mystery of how much we do know. And that's my favorite line in the whole novel.
Yeah.
And it works all the time. We know so little.
Yeah.
When we think we know something. And here's Laurel finding out all these things, realizing her parents were young ones, and that a miraculous marriage is an impossibility. It's just a romance.
Yeah. And that the past has to live for us. We have to re-examine it. We have to examine our lives. That if we allow it to be framed and set in stone, a story we tell the same way every time, that we do kill it. That understanding has to grow. So, well, this is a very emotional chapter to read. We'll finish the novel next time and see what Laurel has gained from this night of torment. Thank you all.
Next week.
Yeah.